Before anyone asks, no relation.
That was my first question.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, Mark worked for the organization I worked for previously, so trust me, I'm used to answering that question. So, as you know, I'm Jeff Buell. I'm the Internet Performance Test Program Manager at CIRA. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about broadband measurement, how specifically data from internet speed tests can be used for communities before, during, and after implementation of broadband infrastructure builds, knowing that many communities are at different phases along their path to meeting their broadband goals. There's many platforms out there. Many people have run a speed test, are aware of speed tests, probably haven't thought a lot about the process and the differences in what the data is used for. So what's the trick for this thing? Oh, solved it. But just before we get there, I just want to talk to you a little bit about the organization I work for, the Canadian Internet Registration Authority. We're best known for as the top level, the managers of the top level dots. Also provide other registry services, other domain services, as well as cybersecurity services, and some free, some paid for, as well as cybersecurity training. But because we're a not-for-profit, any surplus revenue that we generate from those gets reinvested back into the internet and internet projects. We also actively engage in issues about internet governance and policy nationally as well as globally. So how we reinvest, So how we reinvest is this umbrella program called NetGood. A couple of our projects that live under NetGood, the NetGood umbrella. First, probably our flagship is our grants program. Many of you in this room know my colleague Maureen James. She's the manager of community investment as well as the manager of the grants program. So grants funds projects that contribute back to the internet under online safety infrastructure projects as well as policy engagement. Priorities given to northern, indigenous, and rural communities, especially those that are working with and engaging with students and learners from kindergarten to grade 12. It's an annual program in its 10th year, and to date we've funded over 200 different projects. There's the Canadian Shield project. That's a free public DNS resolver. It's made available to anyone living in Canada. It blocks websites, domain requests to websites that are known to contain malware or phishing scams. Last year alone, we blocked nearly 75 million malicious DNS requests. CIRA has always been a big supporter of internet exchange points, advocates for internet exchange points, as these physical locations on the internet where internet service providers are able to peer, exchange data, exchange traffic, as well as meet up with content providers. This Canadian Traceroute database project is an interesting one. It's a new, just developing project. What we're doing with this initiative is mapping and visualizing how our data flows across networks, looking at ways to improve resiliency, to optimize data flow, and looking at it saving money, saving power. Also in situations where data moves from the country of origin offshore and then back again, a term that's called boomeranging, looking at the global, the national impact on data sovereignty of that process. And then finally, there's the Internet Performance Test. So this is a user-initiated software test. So when the person runs the data, we capture that data and provide that data to researchers, policy groups, and communities through our broadband testing project. So across the globe, many governments have set internet speed targets to ensure individuals have access to a minimum broadband service by a certain date. We know that the most underserved are rural, remote, and indigenous communities. So although we know this to be true, what many people feel disconnected from is the process of how those service levels are estimated and how coverage gaps are identified. And so when we do that, most cases, the data that we use, the grand we, not me, what the data that's used to do that can be grouped into three somewhat overlapping categories of data. So first is anything that relates to the base population data, so that's where people live. Quite often in Canada as well as the United States, that's census data, which we know is problematic, not granular enough, especially for Indigenous communities. It's not representative, it's inaccurate and incomplete. Sometimes it's parcel data. We've also seen AI-generated projects that are used to identify buildings, the physical locations of buildings. The second group of data is submitted, ISP submitted coverage data. So obviously that's where networks are, the capacity, the speed. And so what happens, it's usually the combining and analyzing of the first two categories of data, often in a GIS environment where state, provincial, and federal coverage maps are produced. These maps are used to identify gaps in coverage, but also identify the areas that are eligible for broadband infrastructure subsidy funds. The third category of data is where communities can contribute and also to correct any inaccuracies in that data. So that's data from, if you'd like to call it crowdsourced data, user-submitted data. So that could be softer data sets like surveys and feedback, also geo-tagged social media posts and so on. But it's also speed test data. So it's not only for communities, like this is the category number 3. This is where communities can more actively provide data to correct the coverage mapping. But it's not about just contributing the data, it's how communities can use that, leverage that data that they generate. So the results help communities map clusters of demand for better service. Accurate performance data can be used to make the case for both internet service providers and government funding programs alike. This data can be used as evidence to contest claims of higher levels of service than what's actually being experienced by the internet users. And it can measure the success of broadband expansion. So this is what the CIRA Internet Performance Test interface looks like. So you can see a prominent feature is a interactive map that is showing the clusters of the speed test data that's been captured. So anything that's in deep blue is better performing tests. Anything in red is slower speeds. The size of the clusters represent the number of tests that have been run within that area. It's an interactive map, so if I were to zoom in and pan, those clusters would multiply and become more representative of where the test is being run. It's built using a global open source platform developed by MLabs. So obviously we do upload and download speed, but we also capture dozens of quality metrics, latency, packet loss, jitter, and so on. So the data that's captured is anonymized and shared with other like-minded organizations, like I said, policy groups, researchers. We have this, I'll detail this in a second, but the community broadband testing program where we create a geo-fenced community landing page where communities can use this to generate tests inside it, capture them within a bucket. So if you were to run a test, you click that orange start button, and before the test actually runs, up pops a confirmation window. And so the first step is, I think many of you know that locating somebody just based on IP address can be very inaccurate, especially in rural, remote areas and the technology that delivers service there. So this map interface allows the test taker to manipulate the map and drag and drop that pin to correct where their location is. It also asks, there's a voluntary survey on the right, quality of service questions about like how much you pay, what the committed download and upload speeds are, if there's any monthly usage caps and so on. So once the person confirms those things, the test runs, takes about 30 seconds. Up pops the results, and then in our database, those three categories are linked together. So that's the metrics of the speed, the survey information, as well as their corrected location. So I mentioned the community broadband testing program. So there's about 50 of these. These are what we call testing portals or lander pages. The two examples on the right presented last year at ICS, and I think the North End Connect group is here a project update later. So Digital NWT, Northwest Territories, and the North End Connect, looking at connectivity in Winnipeg. So these 50 are very different sizes. These 50 lander pages can be as big as a territory or province, or small isolated community. North End Connect, they're looking at some baseline broadband measurements in Winnipeg's North End as a larger initiative to look at barriers to digital technology adoption and how to remove. The Digital NWT is a broader engagement between communities, decision makers, and policy groups. So just to summarize some of the use cases that we've seen communities use the data for. So speed and performance test data can benchmark connectivity levels as a starting point, and usually as a better received data point than just simply anecdotal information. The data can be used for advocacy work and informing as well as involving community members. So many people that experience poor connectivity, as you know, feel detached, that they can't participate in part of the solution, and this is part of an engagement strategy that can be done ongoing between the individual as well as the community. So the data can support funding requests. Several programs have accepted speed test data to show the need for improvements. Similarly, the data can be used to identify discrepancies, what's claimed to be available on the coverage maps and what's being experienced by most people in the community. So the government of British Columbia, as well as a project in Northern Ontario, have effectively done this by doing a comparative analysis between the ISP coverage data and what's being experienced by people running the internet performance test. And then finally, if broadband investments are being made in a community, the data can be used to help track progress of the improvements. Well, because it's with the internet performance test as an example, because it's granular enough, detailed enough, we can still keep an eye on those hotspots that continue to lack services that they need. So that's it for me. Thank you for your time. It's been an honor and a pleasure. If you have any questions, be happy to take them. If they come to you later, you can grab me.
That's why I'm here. So quick question on your speed test. So you know how you have latency, you have packet loss, you have jitter. Do you have like definitions of those so the end user can understand what those metrics mean?
Yeah, we do. We have an FAQ page, and it's a little bit buried, but that's a very good point. And I think it's really only since COVID that people have even understood the need for upload speed. And now it's latency is becoming an important metric. I think one thing that I didn't mention was our test, and Jamie, I noticed on your video, fast.com come up as a speed test. And so our test is what's called an off-network test. So it runs from a browser on a device, on the home network, runs across the ISP network, runs across carrier networks, all the way to one of 6 internet exchange points. So what we feel is it's more representative of how people use the internet on a daily basis. It's not just contained within the ISP network or an on-network test.
And then let's say I have a router where the cord is loose or the connection isn't secure. So that might not be representative of the actual speeds being realized. And then how do you justify that? Is it like, 2 checkpoints, or how do you substantiate that?
Yeah, so whenever we report publicly on data, we make sure that there's a certain sample size is one thing, because we know that one individual test isn't representative of connectivity for that individual or for a whole community for sure. But I think that's part of a bigger discussion, is for people to understand what are the things that impact speed and performance and what you can do as an individual to improve it, because a lot of people don't know that. And then once you've addressed those things, what can you take to talk to your ISP about what improvements could be made by them? Thanks.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions?
It's more of a comment than a question. I know with some communities in Manitoba, especially those that are satellite dependent, so you have the community talks to the satellite talks to the ground station, then it goes to the web and then comes back.
Yeah.
When you try and run the test, it defaults to where that ground station is.
Yeah.
So for Manitoba, there's 30 some odd communities satellite dependent, and if you try to run the test in any of those communities, it looks like it's Northern Ontario.
Yeah.
And with some of those communities, the graphic interface is so intensive, they can't even load the front page to run the test. I've suggested in the past, working with actually CIRA and MLab, to create a command line interface. And I documented, this is how I think it should work, and to run it. I know that test has been built, but the information is not captured anywhere. They sort of jury rigged something to do with cell phone, some cell project that was done. MLab did something with cell phone. So they jury rigged that to be able to run the test. But so they can run the test, you can run the test, it shows up in a command line, but is not captured anywhere. So that would be my suggestion, is to capture that to a database.
Yeah, really good point. And what you're saying about the geolocation, for sure, on technologies like satellite, it's an inaccurate estimate. And so we're rebuilding that interface to make it more user-friendly, make it more responsive. So it's using cell phone and tablets. So you're introducing the potential for GPS location as well as cell tower triangulation to make a better estimate. But yeah, I agree with that. I'm not familiar with the MLab cell project. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Do we have one more question? Okay, well, let's give it up for Jeff.
Thanks.